What up, YouTube? It's me, Johnny, here with another video. And today I want to talk about what teams I believe won the toughest championships in the NBA's history. Well, at least since the 1980s anyway, until the present day. After reviewing and going through each championship team during that time in their runs, out of the 44 championships we have seen, I boiled it down to a list of about 8 teams that I feel actually fits this criteria of toughest championships won, and I've kind of ranked them accordingly. Now, I know that lately a lot of people, who are in the internet sphere talking basketball, has this issue with winning in sports and this thing called winning bias, which sounds completely made up, like winning doesn't matter. But here on this channel, I am not one of those people. So I want to dive in and make my case for each one of the teams that actually made my list. But before I get started, if you're enjoying the content you're listening to here, please, for me, like the video, subscribe to the page, hit that notification bell so anytime a new video comes out, you will be alerted. Also, I have a podcast that I do that can be found on any of the podcast platforms. You can just search for All You Listening Now Podcast, and I'm literally anywhere: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, you name it, I am on there. So if you're interested in other things that I might be talking about, check out the podcast. But without further ado, let me actually get started with the team that sits in my number 8 spot for toughest championships won, and that is the 2023 Denver Nuggets. Made my list, and I know that some people might be saying, how did they make the list considering they were the number 1 seed in the West the entire season? Well, that is a fair point, but even with that said, they weren't many people's pick coming into the year, having the 9th odds to actually win the title. And when the playoffs started, they were actually the 6th best odds to win the championship. And they were even behind 2 teams in their own conference, and the Golden State Warriors and the Phoenix Suns. Their road to the championship in the playoffs actually wasn't that easy either. Well, outside of the first round Timberwolves. After that, though, starting in the second round, they beat the favorites at the time coming out the West and the Phoenix Suns in 6 games, and then swept the Lakers, who, when the series started, a lot of people were actually picking the Lakers to actually beat the Denver Nuggets, considering they had just beat the last year's champion in the Warriors in the round prior to. Plus, of course, they had Anthony Davis and LeBron James. Yes, I know that they were favored to beat the Heat when they eventually got to the finals, but I still think this championship team, based on everything I mentioned before, they belong to be on this list. Let's go to my number 7 team who won the toughest championship in NBA history, and that is the 1989 Detroit Pistons. So off the top, I know that during this team's championship run, they were actually the number 1 seed in the entire NBA, and going into the year, they had the 2nd best odds to win the championship. But I think this championship run during the 80s that were filled with all-time great teams was the one that fits into this particular criteria for me. During this year's run to the title, they had to beat the well-owned and beat-up Celtics in the first round, and then they played the Milwaukee Bucks, who actually won 49 games that season, and then beat the Michael Jordan-led Chicago Bulls. Now, with that being said, in the NBA Finals, they then swept the Lakers, and yes, I know that Magic got hurt early on in that series, but I still believe that was impressive considering the fact that the year prior to, they had actually lost in the finals to this exact same team. This Pistons team, I feel, is actually underrated in history, and so was this run. Now let's go to my number 6 team, and that happens to be, as they were phrased, Bad Boys 2.0. In the 2004 Detroit Pistons. So many basketball fans, I'm sure, when you read the title coming in, probably already knew that this team was going to make the list. But where, of course, was probably the mystery, right? Some might have this ring higher on the list, But I believe that even though the run to the title was impressive, right outside the top 5, I think fits this team's run. So coming into the season, Detroit had the 7th best odds at winning the title. During the regular season, the Pistons finished as the number 3 seed in the East, winning 54 games. And heading into the playoffs, they weren't anybody's pick to win the East title, let alone the NBA Finals. During this legendary run, I know people jump, straight to them beating the Lakers super team that had Kobe, Shaq, Karl Malone, and Gary Payton on it. But getting there, they actually had to beat the New Jersey Nets, led by Jason Kidd, who had actually made the finals twice prior to the Pistons playing them in the second round. And then they ended up being the number 1 seed in the East that year in the Indiana Pacers, who had actually some talent on that team. The Pacers had players like Ron Artest, who goes now by Medal World Peace, Jermaine O'Neal, who was an all-star caliber player, Al Harrington, who was no slouch, and then Reggie Miller, even though Reggie Miller was kind of on his last legs at that point. That playoff run was crazy by the Pistons, and they didn't actually have one superstar caliber player on their roster, which made the run even more mythical, if you will. The reason why I actually left this title run out of the top 5 for me, though, because back in those days, the Eastern Conference just wasn't as tough as the West during that time, since majority of the best teams actually played in the West. So even though they beat the Indiana Pacers team, as I mentioned, and the New Jersey Nets team that had made the finals, again, we saw when the Nets made the finals, they got beat by both the Lakers and the Spurs, and it wasn't even close in those series. And it would have been the same had any of those teams made it to the finals. So even though I give the Pistons credit for beating them, the East was just significantly weaker during that era. If the Pistons had actually, made it to the finals coming from the West, then this run could have easily been first on the list. If you have this team higher on the list, of course, that's fine. Let me know what you think in the comments. But 5 title runs that I actually have above them, I believe, were a little more impressive. Let's go to my number 5 team on the list, and that would be the 1998 Chicago Bulls. Now, I do realize that going into this season, the Bulls were favored to win the title and finished as the number 1 seed in the East, winning 62 games. But this title run, I don't believe gets the love it deserves due to, well, it has the GOAT on the team in Michael Jordan, and it was the Bulls after all. When you start digging back into that team's playoff run, though, you realize there were some huge factors in play. For starters, as we saw in the Last Dance documentary, the team went in knowing that the team was going to be broken up after this playoffs ended, regardless, even if they won the title. Plus, during this year, the team's second best player in Scottie Pippen wasn't happy with his contract, and he had back issues, which kept him out for most of that season. When the playoffs started, I think everyone just thought they would win due to Jordan, but once they made it to the conference finals, that's when the real fight actually began. It took them 7 games to do it, but they did beat the Pacers, who had Mark Jackson, Reggie Miller, Rick Smits, and Jalen Rose, just to name a few players that were on that team. Oh, by the way, just for fun fact, the Bulls under Jordan only had played 2 other Game 7s prior to this one, and this was the first Game 7 they had actually played since the 1992 playoffs. So that should tell you how good that Pacer team actually was. After they played the Pacers, they had to play the number 1 seed in the NBA in the Utah Jazz, who had John Stockton and Karl Malone. And the Bulls at that time, when they made it to the finals, their only offensive threat they had on their team was Michael Jordan. I mean, Jordan accounted for over 42% of that entire team's points during the finals, which is insane. Also that year, the Bulls only had 1 All-Star on the team, contrary to popular belief that, it was always a Jordan Pippen thing. Nope, by that time, the name Pippen on the jersey, that's all it was. He wasn't Scottie Pippen anymore. And so Jordan was only playing with, 1 All-Star, which was himself. When we talk about a carry job to a title, This ring would even make that type of list for sure, and it's one of the reasons why I have it 5 on my list. Let's go to the number 4 toughest championship won by any team, and that is the 2010 Los Angeles Lakers. During this year's playoff run, the Lakers had to go through a murderer's row to get to the finals. In the first round, the Kobe-led Lakers had to beat the 50-win 8th seed in the OKC Thunder with KD, Westbrook, Harden, who was still young, but still Harden, and then Ibaka. Yes, you heard that right. 50 wins back in those days would get you the 8th seed. They then had to play and swept the 54-win Jazz in the second round, and then in the conference finals beat the Phoenix Suns with Steve Nash, Amar'e Stoudemire, Grant Hill, and Jason Richardson at that time. And then, of course, the finals came, and then they end up having to play the Boston Celtics, who had Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, Ray Allen, and Rajon Rondo, who had actually beat them just 2 final appearances earlier. It ranks up there with the highest opponent's win percentage faced in NBA history at over 63%, and Kobe was the only player on his team that made the top 75 players in NBA history, so this run was truly impressive. You can also argue that the 2009 title run by this team, you could argue when you look at the stats, that it was probably a little bit more impressive than this one. But considering who they beat for the title, no disrespect to the Magic, but I think that Celtics win was a little bit harder and meant a little bit more. Let's go to my number 3 team on the list, and that is the 2011 Dallas Mavericks, aka the last time my city saw a title. Now, this title run will always be high on the list of greatest or toughest rings won, and for good reason. So coming into this season, Dallas only had the 7th best odds to win the title, and going into the playoffs, most people thought, including myself, that once they played the 2-time reigning, defending, undisputed NBA champions and the Lakers, that, the second round, this was as far as they would go. Not only was I pleasantly wrong, but they actually swept them out of the playoffs. Now, I don't think anybody saw that one coming. And then they had to play the fast and upcoming OKC Thunder team, who had just beat the number 1 seed in the whole conference in the San Antonio Spurs. In the second round, they had to play the OKC Thunder in the conference finals, and then they beat them in 5 games. Then it was on to the NBA Finals, where the newly formed super team in the Miami Heat, who had LeBron James, D. Wade, and Chris Bosh, were just waiting for them, and the Miami Heat were heavy favorites going into that series. For the Mavericks to pull off this title win, it would take divine intervention, and it came in the way of LeBron James by far having his worst playoffs performance of his career, giving Dallas the win. Now, Dallas in this playoff run played the 7th highest opponent's win percentage in NBA history, and Dirk was the only all-star that Dallas had on that team that year. During this title run, the team played and beat 7 all-stars from that year's selection alone. This wasn't a carry, job, since Dirk did have help, with Jason Terry, J.J. Barea, Tyson Chandler, Shawn Marion, Jason Kidd, and others. But with that said, this title run is a top 3 toughest rings won of all time. Let's go to my number 2 toughest titles won team, and that was by the 2003 San Antonio Spurs. So some Spurs and even basketball fans might be surprised I have this particular team this high, and maybe a little bit of a shock I chose this version of the team that won this time, during this time period. But this title run is the most impressive one to me. I know when you look at the numbers, around opponents' win percentage that they played, it was only 62% combined. And the fact that, the team had the 4th highest odds to actually win the title, coming into that year, 4th highest odds to win the title coming into that year. So it may not look that impressive, but here's why I actually have it this high. For starters, on that team, their once cornerstone of the franchise player in David Robinson was basically done at that point. So the only real superstar they had left on the team was Tim Duncan, who had to carry this team to the title. During this run, they beat the Suns in the first round, of course, and then in the second round, they played the three-time reigning, defending, undisputed NBA champion Lakers, and that was no easy feat to actually beat them. And they beat the Lakers in 6 games. And for one that wants to actually, see how to operate in the post, if you're interested in that type of old school basketball, people should actually go back and look at film of Tim Duncan schooling every big they had at the time, and that's including Shaq. No one could guard Tim, and it was truly something to see. Also, let me point out, so you don't, kill me in the comments for not mentioning this. Yes, I do realize at the time that Kobe, during that year, was going through his court stuff. But considering the fact that he still led his team in scoring during the playoffs, I'm going to think that, Kobe was good. They then played the Mavericks in the conference finals, who had the third highest odds to actually win the title that year. And on that Mavericks roster, they had Steve Nash, Dirk Nowitzki, Michael Finley, to name a few players. And that team had won a league-high 60 games. Then, on to the finals, where they met the Nets, led by Jay Kidd, who was the favorites to get back to the finals from the year prior to, having actually a real shot of winning, by the predictors. The Spurs, with Tim being legendary, pulled it off. And due to this, it led to the Lakers the next year, in my opinion anyway, to go and recruit that super team we talked about earlier that, lost to the Pistons. This run was one of my favorites, and one basketball fan should actually get behind, even if that team was boring to the masses to actually watch. But I have it number 2. And my number 1, toughest championship to win, and I don't see how anybody is going to refute this one, and that would be, and it was done by the 1995 Houston Rockets. So this title run is number 1, and I don't really actually think it's close or debatable. I honestly think this is the single greatest title run of any NBA team in history, and it might be the greatest title run of all North American sports history if I think about it. And I might do a video on that actually in the future. But to get back on track, if you look at the opponent's win percentage played during that playoff run, they have the highest one ever in NBA history at over 72%, which is truly remarkable. This year, the Rockets came in as the 6th seed, the lowest ever playoff seed to actually win an NBA title. The Rockets also played against 7 All-Stars during the playoffs from that year, and 3 league MVPs in Karl Malone, Charles Barkley, and David Robinson, who was actually that year's MVP and the number 1 seed. David Robinson's team was picked to win the NBA championship, and Hakeem and the Rockets beat them. They then played the number 1 seed out from the East in the finals in the Orlando Magic, who during their run to the title beat the Chicago Bulls that had Michael Jordan back from retirement. Yes, I know Jordan had only played 16 games in the regular season, but hey, a win's a win, right? The Rockets handled and swept them out of the playoffs, and considering that the only All-Star on the Rockets team that year for this title was Hakeem, and Orlando actually had 2 people who were All-Stars from that year, and Penny and Shaq, and they also had Horace Grant on that team, who had actually, made an All-Star team the year prior to. I would say that this title run was bonkers. Speaking of Hakeem, a player I actually have in the top 10, even though it didn't actually happen in this 95 title run, the year prior to when they won the title, this dude went into what Roman Reigns says in God mode, where he made first team All NBA, first team All Defense. He won the league MVP. He also won the Defensive Player of the Year, and he was named Finals MVP. Let me read you the list of players in NBA history that actually has done this. Let me read you this list. The following players are Hakeem Olajuwon, and that's the list, folks. That's it. The absolute definition of a carry job, and he did it twice in a row. Just wanted to show Hakeem some love since, I know people be disrespecting him and all that stuff. But the 95 Rockets team, my number one toughest ring to win. Let me know what you think in the comments, if you agree or disagree. But until next time, I will talk to you all later. Peace.